Advil, which is an anti-inflammatory, but Advil won't get into your brain.
Hmm. True.
But the strong anti-inflammatory component of the psychedelics does get into your brain.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Mushroom Podcast. Today we have Dr. Lyle Oberg on the show. He is the co-founder and CEO of MYND, that's MYND Life Sciences. MYND has 38 licenses through Health Canada to conduct research on 38 different psilocybin analogs, the goal being to determine which one is most effective in modulating the human mycogene and subsequent decrease in inflammatory and immune responses, leading to a reduction in depressive symptoms. Dr. Lyle has had quite an impressive and varied career, which includes being a family physician, chief policy and medical officer for a cannabis company, and he also spent 15 years in government as a cabinet minister in Alberta. This included 4 different positions as Minister of Social Services, Learning, Infrastructure and Transportation, and Finance. So, safe to say this guy has done it all, and we should probably listen to what he has to say. So let's do that now. Enjoy, guys.
Dr. Lyle Oberg, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Brett.
Glad to have you here and talk about everything that you've been up to and your interesting path leading you towards MYND Life Sciences and the many other. Seems like you got your fingers in a lot of pies and you're working on a bunch of different things. So let's go back to just a little bit of a backstory of Dr. Lyle Oberg. You're a physician by profession. And when did you become a physician? Is that family physician or?
Yeah, I was a family physician actually in rural Alberta, which meant that I did things like cesarean sections. I delivered 100 babies a year at one point in time. So I was extremely busy family practitioner.
Yeah. Okay. And how did that tie in with you working with the Alberta government as well? Like, what's the
Well,
timeline there?
yeah, so in 1993, I kind of had a brief glimpse into the world of insanity and went into politics. So I became the MLA for Strathmore Brooks, which is a constituency in Alberta. I then went on to become the Minister of Social Services, the Minister of Learning, which I was for 5.5 years, the Minister of Infrastructure and Transportation, and the Minister of Finance. So I was in government for close to 15 years, a little over 15 years.
And this is while you had your family practice going?
I
What's the,
had my family practice for the first 4 years,
okay.
and then once I got into cabinet, then we weren't allowed to have that because through conflict of interest and
Right.
things like that. So I wasn't allowed to do it. And to be fair, it was so busy being a minister that you couldn't really, get
Yeah.
into that much.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we were just talking before. I'm looking at your work history here, and it makes me feel little bit lazy reading all this stuff. So, yeah, that makes total sense. How could you do both at the same time? I figure being a cabinet minister or being a doctor is probably 60 plus hours a week just in one of those,
Yeah.
if not more. So then you in 2008, take us back to that time, because that was where you made a shift and you went from being a cabinet minister to starting your own DNA research lab by the looks of it.
Yeah, so I left. So what ended up happening, Brett, is I ran for premier in 2006,
Mm.
and I did not win, but I was put in as Minister of Finance in the province of Alberta at that time for the next 2 years. And after that, I decided it was time to let the new premier, have his wings, and it was time for me to go. So I started up a company called C2DNA, which was a gene sequencing company. It was for personalized medicine, and we developed, a lot of good stuff. But at that time, if you think back, like in 2008, 2009, 2010,
Mm.
it really wasn't the time yet for personalized genetics, personalized
Right.
medicine, not like it is today. And so I went on from there to do other things as well. I was the CEO of that company.
Hmm.
And then I went on and became the first CEO and one of the founders of Flower, which is a cannabis company.
Yes. Right. And so you're still working with Flower, the cannabis
No,
company?
I'm not now. I'm off the board. I was on the board until a year ago.
Yeah.
And I stepped down from the board when they went through a merger with another company.
Right. Okay. So then, when, when was it that you started working on the MYND Life Sciences
So I've
project?
been CEO of MYND for about 18 months.
Okay.
And what happened was the founder of MYND, of which I'm a founder as well, but the scientist behind MYND came to me through a personal friend and asked me to help him take the company public and essentially commercialize his research. And so what I did then was a really deep dive into what this guy was doing. And I was quite astounded. It made a ton of sense to me being a medical doctor. It made a ton of sense as to a direction that he was going. So I said yes and came on with him at that point in time.
So what was it that really drew you in? Like, what were, some of those aha moments from your
Well, the aha
experience
moment
in
for me
medicine?
was that he had made the discovery of a gene that essentially turned off inflammation. And when you think about it, like there are so many diseases that are caused by inflammation, and inflammation itself is actually a pretty good thing in certain circumstances. So if you cut yourself, for example, on your hand, the redness is inflammation. But where inflammation becomes bad is when it kind of becomes uncontrolled. And these are the autoimmune diseases where your body fights itself.
Right.
And what it seemed like he had found, at least in his preclinical and mice models, was a way to shut that off. So in one of his experiments, he took a mouse which had this particular gene taken out and injected them with bacteria. So it became a septic mouse, sepsis, right?
Right.
So sepsis is a horrible disease, 40% mortality regardless of treatment. And 95% of these mice died, within a couple hours. The mice that had this gene accentuated, 95% of them lived.
Wow.
And so that in itself was huge. And he'd done some work on cytokine storm, which is what kills you in COVID-19. He had done some work on that, and it looked really, really promising at that point in time. And so that's why I went with him.
So with sepsis, these the mice, the 95% survival rate that you saw there, and just turning off that gene, they just weren't susceptible to, like, they would still have that bacteria in them, they just weren't reacting to it.
Right, right. So if you think about it, so and I'll use COVID-19 as an example,
Yeah.
but you can use any infection. It's not the number of viruses that kill you. Like you don't have an overwhelming, what's called a viremia that kills you. What you have actually, it's your body's own reaction against that virus that kills you. It shuts down your organs and messes up your body, pretty particular. And it's an autoimmune kind of thing. So what this particular gene does that he was studying, the more of the gene, the better, the less of the gene, the worse. So the more of the gene that you had and the more expression it had, it actually shut this off, which is pretty amazing. And which led us to, the psychedelic side of things, which stimulate this gene.
Okay, and so what are you seeing? So I know you guys are working with psilocybin. I just saw a recent article there.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing that with psychedelics, that it's stimulating this gene.
Yeah, and that's the anti-inflammatory property of the psychedelics,
Right.
is that it stimulates the gene. And what you've got to, let me back up a little bit if I can, Brett. So,
Absolutely.
and I'll talk about depression.
Okay.
Okay, so over the last 4 or 5 years, the theory behind depression is that it's a process of neuroinflammation. So there's an inflammatory process in your brain. And if you think about that, Brett, it's really consistent with what people are talking about when it comes to depression and psychedelics. So people talk about taking a hero's dose of psilocybin, for example, and their depression goes away for 3 or 4 months, right? You've heard the stories like that. And
Absolutely.
if you think about it, that has to be doing something to something physical, because you're not going to get rid of, 5 or 10 years of bad memories in space of one treatment, right? You're simply not. So the whole idea behind the neuroinflammatory theory, I think, is really legit. I think it's a very solid theory that the psilocybins work. And the other advantage that psilocybins and psychedelics have is we know it gets into the brain. So we know because it's hallucinogenic. So it obviously gets into the brain, and a lot of things can't get into the brain.
Right.
Like you're not going to take, for example, Advil, which is an anti-inflammatory, but Advil won't get into your brain.
True.
But the strong anti-inflammatory component of the psychedelics does get into your brain, and that's what we think stops the neuroinflammation, which subsequently stops the depression.
Right. So then with this proprietary anti-inflammatory peptide, MAP, as you guys
Right.
call it, right? So explain that a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, because I'm just trying to keep up here. This is
Yeah, I know.
this
I
is
know.
very fascinating stuff.
That's one of the downsides about science, right? Is you ultimately you have to explain it to people, and
Absolutely.
sometimes it's difficult.
Yeah.
So what the MAP biomarker is a biomarker that measures the level of that gene.
Okay.
So it's simply, the gene we were talking about. So it simply measures that level. And this is really cool because up until now, the diagnosis, and I'll use depression as the example, the diagnosis of depression is purely subjective. It's purely, you need to have 5 of 8 symptoms. They have to be present for 2 weeks or more, and they have to be deleterious to you. They have to cause you problems.
Right.
But if we can get, and we think we can with our biomarker, if we can get an objective diagnosis of depression, okay, think what that means. So
Yeah.
instead of you having to wait and your doctor comes in and says, well, let's see how your symptoms are, let's talk a little bit, and then see if you can actually do a test that showed, yes, this is depression. Like, that's huge.
Yeah.
The other side of it is, and probably more importantly, being a doctor, I dealt with a lot of people that had depression. And what you saw is that the first episode was bad because you had people go into a deep, dark hole, and it's a nasty thing. But the second and third episodes, in many ways, are even worse because then they know what to expect. And that's where you see a lot of the suicides, where you see a lot of the really negative consequences of depression occur in the second and third. So if we were able to actually monitor it, and rather than getting down in that deep, dark hole, we're able to tell you, well, you're going down in that deep, dark hole, let's treat it before you get down there. That's huge.
Yeah.
And that's the way we see this biomarker working.
And so the treatment is treatment with psychedelics and
I
other
think,
therapies.
yeah, I think ultimately we'll come to that. I really do. I believe that psychedelics hold a huge ability to treat things like depression. The MAP biomarker doesn't do the treatment, but it certainly tells you when to treat, and everything is pointing towards psychedelics. There's lots of studies that are out there. There's lots of groups that are working on it, but everything is pointing towards the fact that psychedelics will have a treatment role in depression.
Right.
And I'll preface that, Brett, if I can.
Of course.
I believe that depression is not just one disorder. Okay, I believe it's a spectral disorder, which means that there's going to be some diseases some types of depression that may well be helped with psilocybin. There are some types which may be MDMA, there are some types which may be LSD. And I think that they're on a spectrum. And as we study more and get more objective diagnoses of depression, we'll be able to answer those questions. But
Yeah, and I think
in essence, our biomarker, I think, serves as the first step in being able to do that.
right. So if I was just going to do a little bit of a role scenario here, like I go into my doctor's office and I'm going through, I've been through one of these tests with my doctor several years ago where I was diagnosed as mildly depressed, and I went on citalopram, I think, for a little while, which I wasn't a big fan of. But it was just like a questionnaire that I went in that I had to do, right? And 5 or 10 minutes, I did this questionnaire and I had my diagnosis. So then in this new way that you guys are looking at depression and using your biomarker, what would be the next step? So I go to see physician Dr. Lyle Oberg. Do we do that same kind of like questionnaire of working out if I have the depression characteristics, and then what's next?
Yeah, so what you would have to do is establish that it actually is depression that's causing your issues. So your doctor would say, okay, I've known you for 20 years. This sounds like depression. Let's do the blood test. and we'll determine if that's what it actually is. So
Okay.
that changes dramatically, as opposed to doing the questionnaire that says, okay, you've got all of these symptoms, and and not to impugn motive on anyone, but no one is absolutely 100% correct on what the symptoms are. You've got, what is, affect, like they say. It depends on the wording of it. It depends on your schooling. It
Yeah.
depends on, just reading what these questionnaires are. They're certainly not foolproof.
Absolutely. And I think from my just personal experience of being diagnosed, what I found interesting is that at that time it was like I needed something,
Yeah,
like so it's
you're
almost like,
desperate.
yeah, I was kind of trying to think about like, after the fact, so I started feeling better several months later. Was I answering the questionnaire in a way that I knew I would
Yeah,
get the medicine that
that's
I was
right.
seeking, right? So it
You
was a
got it.
pretty big confirmation bias to do that questionnaire. So having a biomarker test takes that out.
And that's the idea behind it.
Right.
And the other nice thing is then we can monitor your improvement. So I'm sure what your doctor said when you went in, okay, take this medication and try it for a month.
Hmm.
Okay, well that month is a long time. That can be, a hellish month,
It was pretty bad.
right?
Yeah.
So if you can actually see improvement, if you
Right.
can have a biomarker that says, yes, I'm getting better, I'm getting slowly better. First of all, from your own psychic, that's huge because
Right.
you're getting better, the light is at the end of the tunnel as opposed to the deep dark hole. And so all of those things are really huge. And the key to it is getting an objective diagnosis that you can follow and
Right.
say, yeah, you're getting better. Or, no, you're getting worse. Let's change your medication onto something else.
Right. Okay.
So
So
that's,
then, so yeah, so you still see some efficacy there with depression disorders and the Prozac, SSRIs, and working with
I don't
those
know. And
medicines.
that's
Yeah.
a tough question. That's a really
Right.
tough question because I don't think you can completely say that SSRIs are going to be gone.
Right.
I think they are still. And remember, I said about a spectral disorder
Right.
where there's varying types of depression. Like SSRIs don't work in every type of depression,
Yeah.
but they do work in some.
Right.
So I think it would be foolish of me to say that SSRIs are going to be gone, but I think
Hmm.
psychedelics form another armament that you can use to fight depression. And it may well be that psychedelics become first line and SSRIs become second line or third line,
Right.
that kind of thing. The safety of the psychedelics is such that they're much safer than many of the SSRIs or other antidepressants that are out there.
I love hearing that from a physician, to be honest. That's such a breath of fresh air in 2021 to hear people having this conversation. We've all grown up with this stigma that psychedelics are drugs and drugs are bad and they're dangerous and they're going to ruin your life. So to hear that there's that flip going on where we know now that, psilocybin, LSD are much safer than Prozac, for example,
Yeah,
is
and
great to hear.
and I agree with that. I tend to be a very open-minded person, and I believe that looking at the facts
Right.
as opposed to just reading it. And as well as I do that the whole history of psychedelics and of
Yeah.
cannabinoids are more political than actual
Right.
reality. And
Hmm.
it goes back to the 60s and everything that and it made no sense. Can you imagine if we would have had the last 50 years of research into psychedelics, where we'd be at? Like, that's just a travesty, right?
Unbelievable. It is. It is. And I know there's been a lot of people working on it underground for the last 50 years, but a lot of their research is not being taken seriously because it was done in someone's basement and that's a shame, right? There's so much good progress that has been made, but without funding and without being able to work in the light and having to work in the shadows, yeah, I agree. Travesty is the right word.
Yeah, and so just the funding part. Our biomarkers being used in a study in Australia,
Right.
or hopefully will be used, that the Australian government, the federal government, put out $15 million to study psychedelics and depression.
Amazing.
Think about that. Like
Yeah,
that's
it's
a
huge.
huge step forward
Yeah.
where the federal governments actually look at that. And we're lucky enough to be partnering with the group at Monash University to be, put our application in for this.
Right.
So if you can imagine that compared to even 10 years ago, like you said, the word psychedelic, the majority of mainstream people just ran.
Totally.
Those are the nutty guys that are on, going on trips, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is still the case, but you know.
Well, I think it's changing. I do believe it's changing. One of the interesting things that I've found is when you actually start talking to people in casual conversations and you say, listen, we're working on psilocybins, it's like, regardless of age, and I will say that many of the people who surprise me are like 75 and 80 years old. They'll say, oh yeah, I've tried it and it was great, or I know someone who's microdosing now and, keep me abreast. I really want to find out more about this. And I've heard that it's not as though just one person has said that.
Yeah.
No one looks at me and says, holy, who are you? What are you doing this for? So
Yeah.
I think it's changed. I really do.
Oh, it is. The minds are really opening up. I think the biggest question. I'm out here in Vancouver Island, so it's a bit of a paradise for psychedelics and cannabis
Yeah.
out here,
Yeah.
and it's very
I'm from
destigmatized.
Kelowna, so it's not as though
Oh,
it's a huge amount different here.
there you go. There you go. Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is people are like, how do I get it? How do I get
Yeah.
access to this stuff? So, that's why there's this huge push going on. Let's get people access to the medicine they need, right? So, um, what? So as far as these inflammatory diseases that you guys
Yeah.
are working on, you've listed five big ones. We've already covered major depressive disorder, and then it looks like Alzheimer's disease. Is that kind of the next biggest one for you guys?
Yeah, Alzheimer's disease is huge. We know it's a central nervous system inflammatory disease. So if you and we just actually our researchers put out a paper in the Lancet, and the Lancet's probably the number one journal in the world, medical journal in the world.
Right.
And it was about it was quite revolutionary actually. They weren't using a psychedelic, but they were using a drug that has similar properties to a psychedelic. And what happened was the Alzheimer's, this was in a mouse model, so take it as such, but mouse models tend to be pretty predictive. And what happened was the plaques, the blockages of the blood vessels that lead to Alzheimer's disappeared. But the really cool thing, the mice regained their memory.
Wow.
And that's, this is the first time that that's been published. And that's revolutionary. And there's a huge if here, like don't get me wrong, there's a huge if here. But if that can be transferred into humans,
Yeah.
it's massive. And we think we know how it does it, and we think we know why it does it, and we think that psychedelics have a similar property. And that's what we're looking at some of these things with Alzheimer's. And again, the biomarker is there because it measures the inflammation part of it. So we know it's an inflammatory disease. And you've got others out there. MS is one. Parkinson's is one. We know those are central nervous system inflammatory diseases. So, we think we're onto something here. We really do. And as I started off this conversation, I wouldn't be with this company if I didn't think we were onto something.
Right. Yeah, you're a busy guy. You got plenty of things to work on, right?
Yeah.
Actually, just back to your point there about being an open-minded individual. How is that working in government? You mentioned that the issue with 50 years of psychedelics and cannabinoids being very politicized. Was there a time where you were like, I need to get back into medicine? This is a challenging industry to work in?
Well, in
Bit of a leading question.
politics, yeah, a bit of a leading question, but I'll bite. Yeah, in politics, you find that there's so many different forces at work that you and I never see. And, I empathize with politicians purely because of those different forces. When you talk to politicians one-on-one, like you and I are talking, many of them will say, yeah, I've done this, or I've seen people that have improved with this, but when it comes down to political realities, these guys have to get reelected. And so they're very hesitant to take a step forward. But when you see groups like the Australian government doing that, like, that's huge.
It's massive.
And I think more and more this is going to come. I think the politicians that we know are more open-minded than you realize. And I think the key is that our industry has to recognize and put forward cogent arguments about why we should look at psychedelics.
Right.
And try and dispel the myth that they're there for people who want to take trips and crazy people and all of this stuff. We
Right.
just need to dispel that. You need to be a good concerted effort, going to them and talking a good cogent line, a
Right.
good cogent argument you need to give them. And I find, and I was a politician for 15 years, and I find that the majority of people want to do what's right.
Yes.
I truly believe that in all people, but I believe that in politicians as well. And maybe I'm naive, but certainly the politicians that I knew wanted to do what was right. And if
Yeah.
you can tell them what is right and show them what is right, you'll get backing.
Right. And I guess, yeah, the risk with politicians or being, when you're up for re-election is that if you misstep and you're still doing what you think is right, but maybe the majority of the public isn't on board with your idea of what's right,
That's
you
right.
lose your livelihood. So it's challenging. I can't imagine working within that sphere and trying to navigate that, especially when you just know something to be true. But
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons we started this newsletter and podcast. It's like, let's help educate people and bring on experts like yourself to talk about this so that, the politicians can take more risks because the public is more informed, right, about what's
And
going on.
yeah, and ultimately it's the public that pushes the politicians.
Of course.
So the politician, 5 years ago who came out and said, we're going to study psychedelics, probably wasn't reelected. However,
Right.
as the groundswell rolls along, which I think you're seeing now, I think more and more of the politicians are going to be open-minded, and as long as things are done in proper settings, say give it a try. The evidence is pretty good. Let's try it.
Right.
I think they'd be foolish not to.
And what do you think the biggest barrier for the general public to try their own psychedelic medicine or therapy? What do you think the biggest barrier is there?
Well, I think that, first of all, there's not a mainstream acceptance from the medical community.
Right.
And ultimately, whether we like it or not, the majority of people get their medical advice from the medical community. So I think you need to make inroads into that. And certainly, I've talked to a lot of psychiatrists who agree with the assist of psychedelics, and I don't think psychedelics is going to be a one fix for everything.
Yeah.
But certainly there's an element of it, and I think as more and more physicians talk about it, as more and more physicians don't feel shackled by it. So what I mean by that is sometimes the colleges of physicians and surgeons will threaten their license if they talk about certain treatments. So I think that that's got to change. I think there needs to be that open-mindedness. But the other thing that we need to do is we need to get good, solid medical evidence.
Right.
And that's certainly one of the things that we're working on, is to bring that solid medical, irrefutable medical evidence. So it's done, like our work is being done at University of British Columbia. I don't think anyone can argue that UBC is one of the top, top universities, certainly in Canada, if not North America. So they have standards, they have protocols, and they don't want their reputation damaged.
Right.
So, those kinds of things, and I think we just have to really just keep pushing and persevering. It's not going to happen overnight, Brett. It's not. But with a concerted push, take a look at cannabis, for example. Cannabis is so much more accepted now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So when I'm saying this, I'm not saying 10 years from now. I'm talking 2 or 3 years from now. I think it will be accepted, and I think we'll have the research, the credible research out there that shows what these psychedelics can do.
Yeah, I agree. And 2 to 3 years, I got my fingers crossed on that one, because we need solutions right now, right? So, The interesting thing that I've noticed, and I know you have a background in finance as well,
Right.
from a financial side with all these public companies, we noticed a big rush into the space in mid 2020, right?
Yeah.
And now we're seeing a big drop down in all the valuations of all these publicly traded companies. Why do you think that is? And what's the path out of that? And what's the light at the end of the tunnel there?
So I think, initially when all the money went in, it was anyone who had psychedelic in their name or talked about psychedelic, people put money in because they had seen what had happened in the cannabis industry, and you had Canopy Growth, you had Aurora, you had all of these that skyrocketed up. So they initially put it in. And then all of a sudden they had to decide, okay, there's however many companies out there, which one is going to be the winner? How many of them are going to win? How many of them are going to be losers? And they got cautious. And keep in mind, what you throw in the middle of all that is COVID.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you've got a cautious market. You've got a kind of a risky area, huge upside, and people are aware of the upside, but they're trying to pick a winner. And they're having a bit of a tough time seeing who the winner is going to be or who the winners are going to be. What we try and do in our company is we try and say, listen, our research is legitimate. It's legal. We have the licenses. We're following protocols that have been well established when bringing out new medications and new drugs. So we're pushing that point of view. But the overall sector, it's hard for people to determine one company versus the other because people aren't. Not everyone is a scientist.
Yeah.
Not everyone understands completely what is happening in all of these companies.
Right.
So I think you're seeing a little bit of the bloom come off the rose with that. And what I think will bring it back are positive results, are showing good outcomes, showing steps forward, all of these things. And I think you'll see a resurgence in the market because ultimately it has to. Ultimately, I think it's just such a big move, such a big positive for mankind. And, I'm not, I will say mankind because, I think the depressions, the central nervous system disorders are such a huge malady for mankind that I think it has to happen.
Right. And the amount of money that, like I was just reading through your deck here, the amount of money that each one of these big five central nervous system inflammatory disorders, like that's going into all of these every year. We're talking about probably collectively, close to $500 billion?
Yeah, and even as a company, if you're able to, and I'm talking purely monetary now,
Yeah.
if you're able to help 2% or 3% or 5% of these diseases, all of a sudden you're a multi-billion-dollar company,
Right.
because the market is that big.
Yeah.
And I think it's getting worse. I really do. I think that there are more CNS issues now, and I classify, and I do that on purpose. I classify depression as a CNS disorder as opposed to a psychiatric disorder. And that's because it's in the central nervous system and because it's due to neuroinflammation. So due to a cause, not a psychiatric disorder. And that may be controversial in some avenues, but I think that there's enough evidence now to be able for me to say that.
Okay. And so if major depressive disorder is classified as a central nervous system disorder, would post-traumatic stress disorder be in that same category?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the psychiatric illnesses are, and it just makes, there's too much anecdotal evidence, and I stress anecdotal evidence, to be purely a placebo effect. Like, let's call a spade a spade. There are people being helped with PTSD. There are people being helped with MDD, with depressive disorders. There are people being helped not out of a placebo effect, but actually from the psychedelic effect of the medications.
Right.
So I think that that's a reality that we're now in.
Yeah. Okay. So it all comes back to inflammation. That's the thesis.
That's a thesis, and I'm happy to say that now because I think that there's enough evidence out there, not just from us, but from a lot of other researchers, in talking to psychiatrists and talking to people who are familiar with this disease. I think that that's the thesis out there that seems to be holding. What I will say though, and I keep in mind, I keep talking about a spectral disorder. It may well be that inflammation is not for every person who's depressed.
Right.
But can you imagine, even if we can get 20% of the people better, if we can get 40%, if we can get 50%, like that's massive.
Yeah.
It's estimated that there's close to 300 million people worldwide that are depressed. And if we can make a dent in that, think of what happens.
Yeah, it's huge.
You know,
So just back to, you were talking about that one trial that they were doing with mice in testing for Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And you said the mice's memory came back.
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
Well, actually, there's strict protocols and all that, but it's quite easy. So basically, you have a mouse who knows a maze, and subsequently they can do the maze again. So they lose the ability to do the maze, and I'm oversimplifying it,
Right.
but they lose the ability to do the maze. When you treat them, they can do the maze again.
Right. That's
You
simple.
know, and
Yeah.
whether or not that applies to humans, again, the scientist in me says I can't say it, but
Right.
the human in me says I sure hope it does.
Right. Yeah. That hope has to be there, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge part of it. Tell me about this partnership with this Revitalist company
Sure.
that you guys have. What's going on there?
So what Revitalist is a company out of Tennessee that is very rapidly growing clinics, and what they're doing is IV ketamine. And ketamine is a legal drug in the U.S. and it is in Canada too. And what it's been shown to do is work in kind of the same way as psychedelics work. And they're getting very, very good results when it comes to depression and other PTSD and other psychiatric disorders. We're actually looking at working with them to use our biomarker on those patients as a validation of our biomarker. So, for example, you have people who come in, and we would do a blood test. They then get treated, and symptomatically they're better.
Right.
Okay, so then we want to do a test when they're better to determine what has happened to our biomarker. Has our biomarker changed? What has the levels done? And the wonderful thing about Revitalist is they're very open-minded in allowing us to come in, but it also gives us access to patients and access to
Right.
different patients. They're growing rapidly. I think they have 5 clinics now. They'll have 10 by the end of this year, and they're aiming at 48 by the end of next year. Right. So having the ability to have that patient population is huge for us, but it's also huge for Revitalist because, again, as we had talked about with depression and other CNS disorders, if you can show people that they're getting better, if you can tell, yes, you're getting better, that's a huge step forward.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and
working with them has been great.
Yeah, and does the placebo effect play a role in that? Because if someone just says, "Here's a pill, this is gonna cure your problems," and
Yeah.
it's just just sugar or whatever it is, a sugar pill,
Yeah.
but I believe that this pill is gonna make me better, and then I feel better. So it's kind of like the comparison that I laid out before of going in and
Yeah.
like almost choosing myself through that
Questionnaire.
questionnaire to get to the answer that I wanted.
Yeah.
If someone then is showing me with a biomarker, hey, you're actually getting better and this medicine is working for you, then that also has an effect. So how do we know? How do we know what the
Because we won't
placebo
tell them
is?
the results.
Okay. Fair enough.
So quite simply, what we do is until our biomarker is fully validated, we don't tell them what the results are. So we want to take away that placebo's effect as much as possible. There could be some placebo effect from the actual treatment. Don't get me wrong. But on the biomarker, we should be able to track that and track it according to the improvement of their symptoms without telling them.
Right. Yeah. And you just see like they're getting better and their inflammation is going down.
Right, and then a year from now, once the biomarker is fully validated, then we'll be able to tell them, yeah, it looks like you're improving. And we'll be able to scientifically say that they're getting better.
So is it like a goal or a target for MYND Life Sciences to be involved in as many clinical trials as possible? And one that comes to mind is like the smoking cessation trial back from Johns Hopkins in 2016, right? Where like, what's the number? 67% of people a year later had still not taken up the habit again.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that would be a fascinating year to watch that biomarker move.
yeah, and I think what we'll see is that like researchers around the globe are crying for something objective. They're crying for that's how we prove things, right? There's either yes or no.
Right.
And if we can have something objective that shows that their treatment is working or that their treatment isn't working, which is just as important because it means that you've got to go in a different direction. If you can take away elements of that placebo effect, I think it's huge. And we're getting really, really good response from researchers around the world who want to use our biomarker in studies to be able to say, give an objective opinion. And that isn't everything because there's still symptoms. No one can discount placebo, and to be honest, if it works, who cares, right?
I'm with you on that one. Yeah, placebo can be extremely powerful, and like the power of the mind is really what we're dealing with here, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these chemicals exist endogenously. Am I saying that right? Endogenously.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
in our minds, right? So, and a lot of these different medicines that we take are just a trigger to release, right? So, placebo can have that effect too, and I'm with you. If it works, it works.
Yeah.
So,
And again, but could be a huge adjunct to any researcher's therapy or any treatment in general, and just the level of objectivity that it brings. Medicine is certainly has some subjectivity. It has there's the art of medicine, but there's also objectivity, which is important when it comes to actual treatments. Putting people on medications that are expensive and potentially having side effects. If you can find something objective to do that, that's huge.
right. So, yeah, and so this biomarker that's going to follow along people's journey, that could be used for people that are just on traditional medications as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of for everything. So you can see if someone's on their SSRIs and the inflammation is getting worse, then you got to try something else, right? And then you can actually see it instead of just having the person come in and say, "Oh, I'm okay," or "I'm fine." Or,
It's trial and error medicine, and I don't say that in a negative way. That's a lot of what it is. And if you said yourself that you were depressed, and I'm sure you went in at some point and the doctor said, well, should we switch the medication, or should we try a different medication? But the key there is try. If we have something objective that we can say, okay, with this level, typically this medication, whether it's a psychedelic or whether it's an SSRI, this medication typically works. That's a huge step forward.
Right. And so what do we have right now in medicine that's an objective way aside from biomarkers?
Oh, just as an example, you come in and look pale. Okay, so what's the first thing your doctor does? He checks your hemoglobin.
Right.
And if your hemoglobin's low, then you have a reason you look pale. So it's an objective thing. He doesn't say, so tell me why you're pale. Tell me, why you think you're pale and all of this. What he does is a blood test, and the blood test gives you a result and he treats it.
Got it. Okay.
So that's the kind of thing we would love to be in. And I don't think it's going to be that black and white and that simple.
No.
But it's kind of position we'd love to be in. And we think our biomarker will move us in that direction.
Right. And you guys got a big 2022 coming up here. Tell me what are the plans for Q1, like the first few months, and then getting these blood tests out. I think is the first step, right? Is like collecting blood samples from people with these inflammatory diseases.
Yeah, we're looking to validate our biomarkers. Our biomarker is being incubated right now as we speak, and it will be ready around the first couple of weeks in February. So what we'll then be doing is collecting blood samples and validating it, and we hope to commercialize it by end of second quarter of this upcoming year. And the advantage of a biomarker is it doesn't have to go through all of the rigmarole and regulations and tests that the FDA puts forward. You can actually do the biomarker before FDA approval, and there's ways to do that. Ultimately, we want FDA approval, and we'll be gathering our data in order to have the FDA approval. But we're going to be pushing hard on this one, and I think people want it, and I think it will help. And so it's a pretty important element of what we're doing in MYND. And the nice thing and I'm now talking a pure business sense, is that you have a psychedelic company that's researching psychedelic that also has a cash flow. Right. And while we're looking at doing all of the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, we'll actually have a cash flow, which is pretty rare.
Yeah, and that cash flow comes from selling these tests.
Yeah.
Right. And so, just looking at your projections here, 4,000 tests sold in 2022, big jump up to almost 30 tests sold in 2023 with a goal of 90,000 in 2024. So if we're going to get to that, or if you guys are going to get to that 90,000 number, how would widespread adopted does this genetic biomarker testing need to be?
Keep in mind, there's 260 million people that are suffering with depression.
Yeah, so it's a pretty small number.
Pretty small.
Yeah,
that's right. So we're not talking a large number. We think our forecasts are really, really conservative. We think, with anything these days, there has to be distribution, there has to be everything in place, and we anticipate that taking some time. But there's other elements of the biomarker too, and we've talked about depression. So let me just change it just a bit here. Yeah. And one of the things that we're looking at as well, we all know that inflammation in general is not a good thing in your body, and it causes all sorts of stuff. So if we can have a kind of a direct-to-consumer type of ability for our biomarker, that's pretty big too, where you can monitor yourself and you say, geez, my inflammation's coming up, I better do something to change that. And that's huge. And we think that there's a possibility that this will help with that as well. So that brings us into a whole nother element of the usage of this test, not just the pure medical physicians ordering it or researchers using it. Right. It actually becomes a DTC component. So again, I drank the Kool-Aid, Brett. You know that.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty bullish on it.
Yeah. I mean, you're the CEO. I hope you're believing in what you're doing. Yeah. So on the D2C side, so I did the ketogenic diet as an experiment a few years ago, and I was measuring my ketones and my glucose levels. Is that similar to what this test kit's going to be like? I just do a little dab of blood on my piece of paper, throw it in the machine, and it's going to, how does that measure? What am I going to look at to know what my inflammation in my body is?
Well, that's one of the things we'll be validating, but we think we'll be able to do a quantifiable, so an actual number that will give you an inflammation index.
Okay.
Again,
and all that still needs to be developed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But the advantage is where we are right now, we think it can be developed very quickly. Mm-hmm. And to be able to monitor, 1 and 1 equals 2 kind of thing, to be able to monitor your overall inflammation, I think is huge when it comes to all sorts of things. Am I pushing my body too hard that it's becoming inflamed? So is there an easier way to push it? What can I do to decrease my own inflammation? Yeah. And, I'd love to see it develop into that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many different ways that inflammation can show up in our bodies, right? Just on the exercise one, pushing your body too hard, I did high endurance or high intensity training for a while. Right. And I just never recovered. I was just sore all the time.
Yeah.
And all the trainers and whatever they were taking and putting in their bodies that maybe I wasn't, or their genetic makeup that they had, just kept telling me don't worry, you'll get past this. And 4 months later, I'm just exhausted all the time. So I had to take a major step back, and it'd be interesting to know if maybe, my body was becoming inflamed. Therefore, I was getting brain fog and fatigue constantly. Maybe that could be another use for this kind of at-home test.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to people taking responsibility for their own health. It comes down to personalized medicine. And, whether we want to say it or not, that's the way of the future, is you have to become your own advocate.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing that more and more here now, where people are taking their health into their own hands.
Yeah, that's an exciting, empowering thought, as opposed to just walking in to see Dr. Lyle Oberg when I'm, 50 years old and all this stuff's built up, and I just expect you to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, I have a lot of empathy for physicians for that reason. You kind of come in and, it's like, hey, doc, I don't feel great. You don't know me at all. You have no idea what I've done in my life, but tell me how to make this go away.
Yeah, and I think that's got to change. I think there has to be the personal responsibility and the personal accountability, and it comes with being your own advocate.
Yeah.
Doing what you can to remain healthy. I think the onus is on us to do that,
Yeah.
and the onus is on the research and the medical profession to give us the tools to do that. And I think that this MAP biomark will develop into one of those tools.
Yeah. So out of this 15 million that the Australian government is putting up, that's just like a funding pool that everybody can apply for. What slice of the pie have you guys gotten from that? And how
So
are you
we
using it?
haven't gotten anything. The competition is still on. We've put in for 3 million for the overall
Excellent.
study. And the study is called psilocybin assisted psychotherapy. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, because I'm not saying that it's going to, I think that there's more than one treatment for a depressed person. It's
Okay.
not necessarily that, psychedelics, here's your pill, you're going to get better. I think there has to be that support. I think there has to be some element of psychotherapy involved as well. You're taking inflammation out of the brain, it has to be replaced with something. So, to say that there's one magic treatment for everything is wrong. It's going to be a combination of treatments but I think psychedelics are going to be a major component of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I also agree that psychedelics are not a magic pill from
Right.
the use in my own life. They just help me gain different awareness about
Right.
my physiology, my trauma, and reform and shift my relationship to those
Right.
things. And then there's work that needs to go in behind that, like different practices that I put in place. I still have to eat healthy. I still have
Yeah.
to exercise. All of that plays a major role. And it's just about developing more awareness is the way I see psychedelics playing that role. Helping people
Yeah.
get past their blocks, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, what I will also add is I think there's going to be two approaches to psychedelics. I think one will be the medical approach, where you have a monochemical, you have a single chemical entity that is used for this. So it's used for depression, or it's used for Alzheimer's disease, or it's used for MS. I think there's also going to be a track that is going to be the microdosing track, which may or may not be, biologic extracts, but that is going to be for mindfulness. It's going to be for awareness. It's almost going to be a preventative type of track that will be in kind of the natural health product side of it. So I really do believe that there will be those two entities, a treatment side and a preventative side. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all evolves.
Definitely, because it's interesting to hear you talk about because that's like a recreational path for psychedelics, which a lot of people are saying is a much more challenging and long road. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say recreational. I
Yeah.
maybe it's a definition of recreational. Like I think of taking a psychedelic and having fun. Well, I don't
Yeah.
consider this the having fun part. I consider it a preventative, good health part.
Right. So in the sense that I still go and get a prescription from my doctor for, 100 milligram capsules of psilocybin or whatever, 100
Well, I
milligram.
would say
I'm using dried mushrooms. I know
yeah,
it's going to be very different in the pharmaceutical stance,
that
but
might be a big dose.
yeah, that's my experience of dried mushrooms.
But
But yeah,
so
go
I
ahead.
think what you'll see is that you'll go to your doctor, you come in, you say, I'm depressed. The doctor will give you a medication.
Yeah.
But I think there also will be a natural health product side, which you will be able to do without a prescription.
Right.
And whether or not it's a smaller dose, whether it's a different type or analog of psilocybin, as an example,
Yeah.
is difficult to say. But I think there will be the two tracks.
Right. And that's kind of what I was speaking to with recreational. Thank you for catching me on that. But yeah, basically that, like, it wouldn't be necessarily through my doctor. Like, I don't
Correct.
have to get a prescription.
Yeah.
It's just, it's
Yeah.
on the shelf beside the lion's mane
Yeah.
and my vitamin D3 and then microdosing capsules,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which would be amazing. I'd love to see that. Okay. So you guys have the Health Canada license there and that's through the University of British Columbia that you guys are able to work on all this and experiment with these clinical trials?
Yeah, we've got what are called Section J exemptions,
Yeah, what's that?
which mean, and we've got 38 of them. So what that means is that we can study 38 of the different analogs of psilocybin legally.
Wow.
And, that's important, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's, to put contextually, there's probably 45 to 50 in Canada, and we have 38 of them.
Wow.
So you have to be at a university in order to do it, and so on and so on. There's a lot of regulations and things that have to go into it, but it gives us the ability to study this. And it may be, for example, that psilocybin is not the strongest in that family. There may well be other ones that are stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of the things that we're looking at with these Section J exemptions.
Is there any that you can think of that might be stronger off the top of your head right now?
Not off the top of my head, but an example that I'll just tell you is like psilocybin and psilocin. In psilocin is probably stronger than psilocybin. So of the other 36 that we have the ability to study, there may well be ones that are stronger, or there may well be ones that are weaker, or there may well be ones that are just different in how they work.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we're looking at.
Makes sense. 38, that's a lot to choose from.
Yeah.
That's a lot of research to be done.
But
it's got to be a few winners in there.
Yeah, the onus on us is to do it properly. And this goes back to how we initiated the conversation. I think you've got to do research properly. And if it takes, a couple extra months, I think you've got to do it. Because to come out with research that is bad does more detriment to this industry than coming out with no research at all. So we've got to make sure that our research is strong. We've got to make sure that our IP is strong as we come out, because we're so vulnerable in the industry because of all the predetermined thoughts about it, that we've got to make sure we have got strong research.
Right. And if some companies come out that are doing things the wrong way, that's where we could potentially have a huge setback and go into another 50-year dark period. I don't think it's going to happen this time, but
yeah, I would hope that it's not 50 years, but it certainly has the ability to set us back.
Yeah, definitely. So a little while ago on the conversation here, you mentioned that all of these inflammatory diseases seem to be getting worse, like MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. Is that true? Are all of them trending up? Every single one of them?
Yeah, I think all of them are trending up. And the cause, we don't know. So there can be two causes. First of all, there's more being diagnosed. So we're diagnosing things earlier. We're calling them, their names earlier. Or second of all, that legitimately is more cases coming forward. And I think we're seeing more cases coming forward in this. It's certainly, in MS, I would imagine now that everyone knows someone who has MS. I would bet money that you know someone who has MS. Yeah. And I think we all do. So we know that one's coming on. Alzheimer's. It is an element of the population aging and living longer. So we're seeing more and more of it, but more and more of it's being diagnosed. It used to be 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was just the crazy guy across the street kind of thing. Right. But now we're actually saying, listen, this guy, there's an illness there and we understand it and we're diagnosing it and we're treating it. So things have changed, but I do believe that the diseases are becoming more recognizable and more prevalent.
That's scary. But understandable. What do you think, aside from just having like better testing and awareness around a lot of these illnesses, and that being part of the reason why we're discovering more of these illnesses, what do you think some of the other societal reasons are, from your experience as a physician over 30 years? What are we
That's a tough,
dealing with?
that's a tough question. I think you can hypothesize that, from our diet, we know that there's a very intimate relationship between the gut and the brain. There is that's research that's coming out too. So are we ingesting more toxins? Are we ingesting things that can damage the integrity of the brain? It's possible. The research is still not out there. Do I think it could be happening? I think the answer is yes. I do believe that. I think we're exposed to more things now than we ever were. And at some point that has to play a role in what is happening.
Yeah.
We just have to identify it, and we have to be able to correct some of these things. But for me, I can't say carte blanche, it's this or it's that. But I think
So
overall
many things.
we're trending, right?
Yeah, and there's the widening wealth gap, and
So all the
there's
stuff, all of the
yeah that
above,
yeah
check box E,
yeah
all of the
exactly.
above.
So a lot of psychological stress, and overwhelm of the way that we're working now, and feeling more
Yeah.
disconnected. There's a million different things. I just wanted to get your opinion on that. But is there anything else that you can tell us? Exciting things coming up for Mind before we wrap this up here?
Well, we've got a lot of exciting stuff happening and a lot of stuff coming forward. So, unfortunately, being a public company, I can't really talk about all of it.
Right.
But you can rest assured that we're not just sitting on our laurels and not doing anything. We've got a lot of stuff happening, and it's pretty exciting. And from my personal point of view, it's an absolutely amazing thing to be part of, to have the potential to help people. That's why I went into being a doctor.
Right.
And this is just an extrapolation of that, is the way I see it.
Yeah, having an impact on a bigger scale.
That's right.
Well, I really appreciate you jumping on and telling us all about your life and what you're up to. I can't wait to just continue to follow the journey of Mind and Dr. Lyle and see what you guys can achieve through this
Yeah.
biomarker testing.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. It's been great, and it's nice to be able to sit back and talk. Too much, and this goes back to my political background a little bit.
Right.
Too often, what is happening now in the media, it's a 3-second or 5-second or 10-second soundbite.
Yeah.
And I think you may have gleaned that it would be very difficult to give a 3-second or 10-second soundbite about mind.
Oh, yeah. I spent hours reading about you guys, and I still was kind of like, what are we working on here?
Yeah.
So I've learned a lot more. I have a lot more context now, but
Yeah.
we need to ingest some more longer form content and
That's right. And
draw
that's the
out.
nice thing about podcasts, right?
Exactly.
We can have a good conversation, a casual conversation, and talk about the important stuff.
Yeah, you got it. Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks again, Dr. Lyle, and we'll catch up soon.
Thanks, Brett.
All right.
Well, that's it for this week's episode, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate all you guys being here on this educational journey with us all. If you want to continue your education around the art, science, and business of psychedelics, I highly recommend you sign up for our newsletter. Just go over to dailymushroom.co, pop in your email, and every Friday you'll get a newsletter straight to your inbox that keeps you up to date on everything happening in the world of psychedelics. You can also follow us on Instagram at dailymushroom.co and TikTok at dailymushroom.co. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you on the other side.